Couple of things I want to call your attention to, and that's the schedule. As you know, we do not have a meeting next week. You're off on the 20th, but on the 23rd and the 24th, you are over in Charlotte for another weekend. So your second of 3 face-to-face weekends is next weekend. I'm sorry, the weekend after the 23rd and the 24th. You do start, and this is at the Charlotte Center. You start on the 23rd at 9 o'clock, and then you go to 4 or thereabouts, and then on Sunday you start at 9 and you go, I think, to about 2. Now, bring your lunch on Sunday, and just to remind you, I will not be there, but Dr. Davis will be taking both classes, and he will be, of course, conducting everything. I'm going to be grading papers, although I can truthfully say I have caught up on all of my papers to grade so far, but maybe in 2 weeks I'll have a bunch more to grade. So the next meeting that we will have a Zoom session will be on the 27th, the Wednesday, February the 27th. But the weekend, 23rd, 24th, look forward to that. Kind of give you a teaser about what you're going to do that weekend. You are going to be doing with everything court cases. And what I know, Dr. Davis is going to have some interesting court cases that are relevant to us here in North Carolina, court cases that have some relevance for South Carolina as well. But I think you will enjoy that activity, because one of the purposes of this particular course, 708, which is policy, it is also ethics and the law and advocacy. So this second weekend will be devoted completely to the law and the laws that affect us in public education. The next weekend, the last weekend that we have together, and I'm not sure what date that is. I don't think I have it in front of me, but that weekend we will be talking about advocacy. We'll also be making sure that you have all the projects that you need for the PAP. So that's kind of our goal for that. So, hey, Courtney. So I'm just missing Lindsay. Okay, she should join us. All right, so welcome everybody. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because we've got a little bit to do tonight. A couple of things I want to call your attention to is, where are you? And so let me pull up this. This is listed under week 2, I believe, but it is where your graded assignments are due and the things. So just to kind of give you a point of reference of where you should be. Now remember, in this course, I really don't have any really hard, strong deadlines, but I do expect that you kind of keep up, because it's gonna hit you fast and very hard very quickly. So I've given you kind of an outline of when it may be due and some of the things. So you should, if you are following along, by week 13 to 13th, you should have knocked off a couple of these things up here. The draft policy, the policy origination, that's the flow chart, answered one of the Fowler questions, a couple of the scenarios, and your first presentation should be in there as well. So don't worry about it if it's not. I know, Shantae, you need to download presentation chapter 2. You need to go to course assignment or course assessment and go ahead and download that. I don't think I saw it in there, although you sent it to me electronically by email, but go ahead and do that so I can put attach a grade to that. All right, so any questions on this? I just want to bring this up to kind of keep you kind of focused, because it is going to move very quickly once we get into February and March. I want to talk, and I also want to talk a little bit about the ethics scenarios. You've been doing a great job on those. Kind of want to give you some just broad general feedback as we are getting onto those, which I'll do in just a second. But any question on the schedule? Just remember, our hard fast deadline is actually April the 29th, but I can go up until May the 5th. So make sure you're working on that. Just to remind you as well, the due dates, the location, it's either going to be discussion board or course assessment. Either one of those two will be where you find all of these items to download them. Are there any questions? Are you having any problems downloading the assignments or anything like that? But I think everybody's downloading stuff. All right, moving forward then. So, let's go to our 708 shell. By the way, our next face-to-face, the third face-to-face, is at April 6th and 7th. All right, so tonight, the 13th. By the way, if you have not gotten something for tomorrow night, remember tomorrow is Valentine's Day. So if you have a loved one, or you're looking out for someone, or if you want to put a hint in your husband's mind that this is kind of what you want and it's not an iron or some kind of household appliance, you might want to go ahead and do that. Courtney, you may want to put a word into the future husband of yours about what women like for Valentine's Day, and it really is not a household appliance. So anyway, just remember, tomorrow's the 14th. And you all are lucky because I have class tomorrow night. I've got my master's program. Going to hold them for an hour to keep them away from their loved ones. So that should go well. All right. So this week, what I have added on our shelf for session 3, Shantae sent me her Fowler Chapter 2 presentation. She's added voice to it. So I have posted that there if you've not had a chance to see it. And it is there. You see the ethics scenarios this week. 4 and 5 should be your focus, or should have been your focus. And what I really want to talk about for the next few minutes before we do our presentations has to do with General Statute 115C 288. Anyone from South Carolina? Remind me again. I know, Shantae, you're kind of South Georgia.
I work in South Carolina.
Courtney, you're South Carolina?
Yes, but I just got here like 7 months ago.
Okay. All right. So what I want to call your attention to, and I'm going to go ahead and unlock it so you can pull it up yourself, but I want to look at North Carolina General Statute 115C 288. And just so you'll know, Courtney, South Carolina doesn't have a similar statute. I think they have something called General Statute 59, but it's not as succinct as here it is in North Carolina. And the reason I want to do this is because to reflect on some of the scenarios that you all have turned in to me. I don't think I've done this yet, have I? Because I did it with my other class, but I don't think I've done it with you all. But I do want to talk about North Carolina General Statute 115C. It is open for you, and basically, and I'm not reading it, but it is the North Carolina laws that are specifically related to what the duties and the powers of the principal are. Now, I know you all are in the program to become more than principals and to move up the ladder to become superintendents or associate superintendents, but if you are currently in the position of principal or an assistant principal position, you need to know these and know these well. And the reason for that is because as you are doing your scenarios, I have noticed that sometimes that we're not quite following everything you need to do by North Carolina General Statute. And again, South Carolina cannot be that different. But whatever I say tonight about North Carolina, if you are interested, you might want to just touch base with someone in your state, your central office about that, specifically for South Carolina. In your scenarios, you are acting as the principal or the superintendent, and a lot of times when you are giving me the answers to the scenario, you're leaving out a huge step, or you are forgetting that there are certain things that you don't have any recourse but to do, and the biggest one is to call law enforcement. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. This and one more PowerPoint after this one. But the North Carolina General Statutes 115C 288 really deals with the powers and duties of the principal. By principal, that means if you are an assistant principal and your principal's not in the building, you are the principal. By the powers of now when the principal is in the building, then the principal is the ultimate person who is responsible for these things. But if you are acting, or if that person is just out of the building for 30 minutes, you have assumed the responsibilities of the principal. So this doesn't just apply to the principal. It could be you in a role, if you are an assistant principal, acting as a principal. Your duties in North Carolina are spelled out very specific, and they're all in this one place, 288. And so I'm not going to talk about much of them, but the first one, grade and classify, this is something that those of us in the central office love, or superintendents love, because when a parent calls and they tell you that they tried to work with the principal and the principal won't move their precious little Sally out of Mrs. Smith's class, there is nothing we can do about it. And as a superintendent, and if you've ever been pressured by the superintendent to change a grade, change a teacher assignment, you really do have the legal ground to say no to that, because the power of North Carolina is clearly in your position to grade and classify. That means you are the one who determines, even if they don't pass the read to achieve, you are still the one. Now, you may have to jump through some hoops for your district, but you are still the one who makes that grade classification for next year. You are the one who makes that final grade of an A or a B if there's some kind of conflict about it. That is all your job. There is nothing any of us at the central office can do about that. So that is a duty that I am so glad for having. You don't know how many times I've gotten out of a parent conference by saying, I'm so sorry. The law gives that to the principal, but that's your responsibility. Then also the one that I know you're all familiar with, and that is to make accurate reports to the superintendent and to the local board. Most of you do not make direct reports to the board, but you do it through the superintendent. You may think of fire drills. You may think of other things that are required. The Safe Schools Act requires certain kinds of reports. So there are a number of reports that you are required to turn in. Now the problem comes here for those of us who work in the central office, or for you when you work in the central office, is that if you are not submitting an accurate report, it throws off the district's report. And ultimately, the law changed a couple of years ago that the General Assembly and the State Board of Education and the Department of Public Instruction can now penalize your district for turning in inaccurate records. And so when you as a principal turn in a record to your superintendent, usually districts now require that you sign an affidavit that it is correct. That kind of passes the ball on and puts the onus on you. Because if that report's incorrect and there's some money tied to it, the State Board of Education, the General Assembly can come back and can pull back pay or claw back pay from the superintendent. And now your superintendent, or when you become the superintendent, you're not really going to want the state to be clawing back your pay. And so you want to make sure that when you get those reports, and that's why superintendents and people in the central offices are so persistent about your reports. You need them, and you need them on time, and they need to be accurate. Because when you turn in as a principal or an assistant principal a report and it's a week late, you have ultimately thrown off the district. And those reports that you have to turn in, trust me, the district has to turn them in as well. So accurate reports, you got to turn them in. Got to have those fire drills. C is kind of a nebulous type thing of improvements of the community spirit. You've got to discipline students, of course. That's a huge thing. You got to protect the school property. And part G, we're going to spend a little bit more time on in just a few minutes, because this is what I've discovered in your ethics scenarios, that there may be a misunderstanding, or maybe not quite a full understanding of what the law requires you to do as principal. All right. You got to have those school improvement plans. They're mandated by law. You got to make them available. Your school budget has to be written on an 8th grade education level, and it has to be posted to your district. Has to have your budget should be posted to your school website. The district has to have its budget posted. And again, I'm not making it up. It has to be on an 8th grade level. So anyone with an 8th grade education ought to be able to look at your budget, ought to be able to look at your school improvement plan and say, I understand it. So the intent is to keep us from using jargon, from using all those letters that we use, is to try to make it as transparent as possible. Do you think charter schools have to do this? No, they don't. You're also responsible, if you're in a high school, for eligibility for driver's ed. You got to establish school improvement teams. And letter M was something that was recently added, and that has to do with several years ago, North Carolina added special provisions for the military, where family members of the military don't have quite as many hoops when they register for school, or when they're absent. There's some uniqueness for our military. All right, so very easy. As a principal or assistant principal, all you got to do is 115C, 288. You got all your duties there. Now, the reason I wanted to talk a little bit more about this before we start talking about Fowler is I wanted to look at the North Carolina duty to report, because again, this is what I'm seeing in your reports to me that show that there may be not as much understanding of this as it needs to be. I have unlocked it, so it should be available to you. I don't want that one. It should be available to you now. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this one. Okay, and again, it relates to the scenarios. And if you are a principal or an assistant principal, these all apply to you. The North Carolina duty to report. All right. North Carolina law establishes a duty to report if you are a school administrator. Now, that means if you are a principal, that means, Annie, if you go to cover your high school, Kannapolis High School, for the day, and you are the administrator in charge, this is you. So administrator is a broad term that applies to whoever is in charge of that building that has a license. And Annie, you have an administrator's license, and any assistant principal or any principal has a license, an administrator's license. So it could be you, Courtney. When you become an assistant principal or when you move into that administrative position, you are then going to become the administrator and have a duty to report. So again, once that license there and you have a responsibility, and even when you get that administrative license, Courtney, and you are still maybe in the classroom and the principal and assistant principal aren't there and they make you in charge, if you have your license, then you are the administrator. So all this applies to you. Okay. This is all established in 15C 288, and it requires and it sets out the procedures and what specific guidelines that are required. So here they are. And the reason I want to tell you this, and I want to make it really clear, these are reportable offenses. And that means that you as the administrator must report them. And there are two places you must report them. Number one, first and foremost, is law enforcement. Number two is the superintendent's office or whomever you report stuff to in your district. It's not always the superintendent's office. It may be the public relations person, but you need to find out who is that person in the central office that gets these reports. And I'll tell you, no matter how big the district, it's probably someone close to the superintendent's office, if it's not the superintendent himself or herself. All right, so you need to find out. Number one, you need to find out who at the central office gets these reports, because it's pretty clear. But number one, you report it to law enforcement. If you have an SRO officer in your building, that's law enforcement. Then pick up the phone, go down the hall, get the SRO officer, bring them in on it, pick up the phone, call the superintendent's office or whomever and say, hey, this is what happened here. And I would also make a report of it. If your district has a manual reporting system of some kind of form, I would also follow up with that. If you do not have a form that's required to the superintendent's office, I would recommend that you create a form that stays in your office, just to kind of make sure that if something ever goes awry, that you have showed that you have reported this. And I would record the date the date and time you reported it to the law enforcement, as well as the date and time you reported it to the superintendent's office. If you don't have a form, if your district doesn't have one, then I would certainly create a little file for myself. So there are 11 things that immediately, if they happen in your building under your watch, you pick up the phone, call the SRO officer, and then call the superintendent's office. Now, these make sense, but in your scenarios, and a couple of times I've seen this step of law enforcement has not been there. And so that's why I want to make sure you guys don't get in any trouble with this, because I'll tell you, 5 years ago in a district very close to the one that I was the superintendent in, the principal of the high school was charged with a misdemeanor for failure to report. What had happened was that they had had a sexual assault or possible sexual assault. Law enforcement got involved with it, and they pursued it, and the principal's office failed to bring them in on board. They heard about it from someone else in the community. And so when they started investigating, they discovered that, yes, the principal had known about this. And yes, the principal had failed to do the reporting, had actually failed to report it to the superintendent's office. So this principal was charged with the misdemeanor, and their license could be revoked as well. So it does happen. Now, most district attorneys who aren't running for election will probably let you slide once, unless it's something serious. Because if something like a sexual assault comes up and you didn't report it and the public had to report it to law enforcement, they're going to be very mad at you. They're going to think you're trying to hide things, because they know we don't want people to think that Kannapolis High School is a dangerous place where sexual assaults happen. So they may think that we really are more concerned about protecting the image of our school than we are about reporting offenses. So again, number one, if any one of these 11 things happen, SRO first, bring them in, and then that phone call to the superintendent's office. It may be as simple as the superintendent's office says, thank you, please send us a report when it's done. Or it could very well be they will say, someone's coming out. And smaller districts, probably someone from the central office will come out to be a part of the investigation. Okay, before you do anything, before you do any investigating, law enforcement, that call to the superintendent, we believe we may have a case of this, I'll let you know. So here they are. Very simple things. These are spelled out by 115C 288. No ifs, ands, and buts about it. In your future scenario cases, when you report back to me, I'm fully expecting you to see, or to that, one of the first things you do is pick up the phone and call the SRO or law enforcement. And then very quickly after that, the superintendent's office, and then you begin your investigative part, your role as a judge and jury. All right, so here they are, the 11 of them. Number one, of course, is assault with a serious injury. And again, the PowerPoint is available to you. I would certainly look at it occasionally to make sure that if something comes along your way that you are prepared. And this could be anything that's serious personal injury. And there they define it up into the 6 different things that constitute serious public injury. Now, this is not just talking about students, it's also talking about staff, and it also could very well be talking about volunteers in your building. Now, a volunteer is different from a guest in your building. A guest in your building may be someone who's coming to pick up their child, but a volunteer is someone who's there on a mission or a task for the school. A volunteer may be a tutor. A volunteer may be someone working in the office. So the category of volunteer is protected, as well as employee and students, and all of these apply to volunteers in your building. We're not so clear about whether or not it applies to that parent coming in to drop off something or to bring their child to school. All right. So number one, assault with serious injury. Number two, anytime a weapon's involved. And here it spells it out for you, the 16 different things that constitute the state's definition of a weapon. And you'll be surprised to see some of these things, air rifle, air pistols, knuckles, razors. I mean, yeah. It's interesting what they list, but it's not an all-inclusive list too. If you feel like that this could be used as a weapon, even if it's not one of the 16 things listed, I would encourage you to consider it an assault with a weapon. An assault with a scissors. Scissors obviously aren't listed there, but if someone comes at you with some scissors, that's an assault with a weapon. Those scissors become a weapon. So do not be fooled into thinking it's got to be one of these 16 things. It is a weapon. You can weaponize just about anything, can't you? So think of it, was this being used as a weapon? Immediately, law enforcement. All right, please stop me if you have any questions. And again, I don't look at the chat thing, so you just have to speak, unmute and speak up. Any kind of an assault on a school official. Several years ago in North Carolina, probably about 10, North Carolina changed the definition of the assault on school officials and made them public officials. If you teach in North Carolina, if you are a volunteer in one of our schools in North Carolina, or if you principal or an employee, you are a public official. And if someone assaults you while you are doing your duty, the criminal charges are much, much higher. And I believe South Carolina has this as well. But you have been defined as a public employee. And that's even volunteers who are in your building. If they're in there and you know they're volunteer and you have sanctioned their volunteer activities, they are a public official. And the criminal offense is much higher if someone assaults a public official. Now let's talk about this. For those of you in elementary school, you're in kindergartner and this little kid is going way off the racket and starts kicking teachers and anyone else and you. Is that an assault on a government official or school official? This little kindergartner is just crazy, kicking, spitting, biting, bites you. Is that an attack on a government official, and does that require, or is that considered an assault? What do you think? What are you going to do with that little kindergartner?
I think it depends on like the intentions of the kindergartner. I mean, if you're trying to de-escalate them and they're doing it if they're angry because of another situation, it may be viewed differently. But if they are coming at you and they're making threats at you, I mean, it could be viewed that way, but probably less likely because of the age of the student.
Anyone else? All right, let me go ahead, Annie. Or Annie, were you talking or someone else? I didn't.
It was Courtney.
Okay.
I guess my question is, does that statute have age limits? I mean,
Nope.
to that, like, is there an age range?
No,
that-
it's not. What you see is what it is.
Well, I would consider that. I mean, because if a 17-year-old student bit me or kicked me, it would be considered assault.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on? Because this is one that gets.
We've had,
Go ahead.
yes, sir. We have had to call the police before. It is certainly a last resort. And usually once that happens, there's been a pattern of that behavior. You know, it's, I think, qualifying, you know, what Daryl was saying, it's not so much just an angry kid, but there's perhaps some mental health concerns. But yes, there has been now, as far as filing charges, sometimes that I think I can recall one time when that has happened, but more or less it's just we're calling the SRO just to get the paperwork and to also make a statement to the parent involved.
Okay, and there's a distinction here, Annie, and everyone, in filing charges, because generally the SRO is going to do that and not us. So here's my take on this. I think it's a murky area. I think that little kindergartner who just absolutely loses it and has no history of losing it, I think that that's probably going to be taken in consideration. But if it were me, I would call the SRO officer and I'd say, hey, just want to inform you of this, because at that point you can check off your duty to report. The SRO can say, you know, he's 5, he didn't mean it. Let the SRO make that call. Now, don't file charges. Just call the SRO and let them be the judge of that, because they ultimately will be the one who decides whether or not to file those charges. But just on the safe side, I would consider that something that I would certainly call law enforcement about. And I'll tell you too, you know, you may see it that way, but your classroom teachers, probably the one who was bitten, the one who was hit, they probably see it more as an assault than you do. So I would definitely call law enforcement, and that would also, as Annie said, sometimes that may be the beginning of some behaviors that become a pattern, and law enforcement needs to be a part of it. So I would really recommend you highly, don't play with that one. Just simply call the SRO and let the SRO make that call. If you're in middle school or high school and somebody hits someone, you know, obviously that's an assault. All right, bomb threats, bomb hoax. Of course, those, and the definition of any kind of public building includes your gym, your buses, anything that the school system ultimately has control over. It also means that if you are renting a facility for your graduation, or if you're renting a facility for your convocation, by the very nature of the fact that you are renting it, it becomes a public facility. It becomes a public building that you are using and people can be charged for, and I would certainly encourage you to. I would encourage you, I'm not encouraging you, I'm telling you that this is something you need to report to law enforcement, to that SRO. Please stop me as we go. Of course, if someone sets fire to your building, that's something you'd want to call law enforcement about. Or if they set fire to the trash can in the bathroom. Is that something you would call law enforcement about? Oh, absolutely. Nod those heads up and down. Absolutely, you'd call law enforcement about that one. Homicide makes, of course, makes sense if somebody's dead or dies. And kidnapping, holding them against their will, regardless of the age, that could be considered. And actually, non-custodial parents can kidnap too. Number 8, underage possession or control of alcoholic beverages. So that child, the middle school child that comes in, gets off the bus, Daryl, if they smell like alcohol, come here, SRO. Let me share this with you. And again, all you are doing basically is bringing law enforcement in, letting law enforcement make that call. How many of you have an SRO in your school? A full-time SRO? If you don't have a full-time, you have two, Daryl, good. If you don't have an SRO, then you probably have one at the middle school or the high school nearby that you utilize that kind of comes, and if not, just to call into the sheriff's department if you're in the county, or to the city police department if you're in the city. That's their job. All right, possession of a controlled substance. Here's another one that that someone told me about last night in my 700 class. I didn't realize this, but I thought that school systems are now creating new policies about vaping. She told me last night that her school district, they actually caught someone who had met in the vape cigarette, had met, and that was a growing trend. And this was a rural North Carolina county, so I'm sure if it's growing in rural North Carolina, it's probably something that you guys are going to be getting as well. A lot of board policies have not yet gotten to that vaping stage of putting that into your board policies, but the North Carolina School Boards Association is working very hard, if they haven't already created a policy in your smoking or your controlled substance, but that's a violation. So, Josh, if a child comes to your school with a pack of cigarettes in their pocket, what do you do?
Well, after seeing this, I assume I report it.
I would call the SRO. The SRO could do whatever they want to with it. But isn't that possession? And cigarettes are a controlled substance. Prescription drugs. That child that comes to the office and gets his Ritalin, if he gives it off to another child, that is unlawful and needs to be reported to the SRO and let the SRO handle it, as well as you handle it with that child's parent. Now, I know this seems like overkill, and I know your law enforcement probably is not going to want to pick up the phone every time you call about a child with a Ritalin exchange. It's the law, folks. And you don't want to be guilty of a misdemeanor. And I would much rather have the law enforcement think I'm overreacting than for that one time when you don't and you get yourself in a lot of trouble. You lose your license, your professional license, as well as commit a misdemeanor. Firearms, here they are. A weapon, and again, if you have an elementary school and that little kid comes in on the weekend with his Swiss Army knife that he forgot to take out of his book bag, I know it may be overkill, but I would still want the SRO or someone to look at it and make that call. And of course, you would subsequently call too and say to the parent, against board policy, we had to, here's what we had to do. Anytime by the way, anytime you have law enforcement speak to one of your children, try to get the parents involved from the very beginning. Okay. Rape, of course. Now, this is an interesting thing that was brought out too. The definition of rape by the North Carolina General Statute 115C288 only considers male to female rape, doesn't consider male to male or female to, well, it could be female to female because it doesn't define, it has a very statutory rape, it has a very definitive definition of what rape is. But I would also encourage you that if any kind of case comes to you where a young fellow boy says he's been molested or has been penetrated, then again, that is also, even though it doesn't technically meet the definition here of rape, it does meet the definition of sexual assault a little bit later on down here at the bottom. So, and again, anything about sex, anything. When someone mentions something that's inappropriate about sex, call the law enforcement, bring them on board with it. Now, let me stop here because sex is usually the one that we hear the most about in court cases or when the public gets a hold of something. Here's what we've been advised to do when I was superintendent, and we advised all of our principals in Caldwell County. I do encourage you to maybe double check with your school system to find out how they need to handle this, because it may vary. But a standard practice for us in Caldwell County was that anytime a child came to the office and reported any one of these 16 things, we call law enforcement first. And we got them in, and then the superintendent. And then we got law enforcement to do their investigation. And we kind of stood back. We did not interfere with their investigation. We didn't call teachers to, I mean, we were accommodating. We'd call teachers to come up, we'd call kids to come up, and we were accommodating. But we didn't go out and try to do our very own investigation at the same time law enforcement was. Because we didn't want to interfere, we didn't want to trip up, we didn't want to alert people. But anything serious like any one of these 16, I would encourage you to take your cue from law enforcement. But remember, just because when a child commits one of these 16 things, they have committed a state crime. But they have also committed a violation of your board policies and a violation of your school policies. So even if they come back and the district attorney says, we're not going to charge that child for touching the girl in the hallway, you still, at that point, have your own policies you can apply. And you don't have the same standard that law enforcement does. Yours is much more simple. You saw it, you believe it, or someone told you it happened, you have a credible witness. That's what you need. You don't necessarily have to have the camera showing it. You better be careful, because if the district attorney says that the child, and they're not going to say they're not guilty. They're going to say we don't have enough to charge them. But you still can apply your own board policies. The child was out of place. The child was in a place that was off limits. The child should have been in class. There are a number of board policies that you can apply. So there are two investigations. There's the law enforcement one that you kind of play a back role to, but also you can be checking in without interfering some of the basic local Board of Education policies or even your school policies. Now, go ahead, Daryl.
We had a situation like this last week, and with that particular situation, exactly what you said, we had to execute it in that manner. One reason being, if we were to take a statement from the student and that statement varied from the statement they gave police, then the entire case could be kicked out of court because there's a variance between the statements.
Right.
So you're absolutely right, Doc, in saying that, and I actually experienced that last week.
And if you do that and they get really, really mad at you, they could call you interference. You could have the interference with the case. So back off on particularly these 16 things. Take your cue. Sit down with the law enforcement and say, now, we know there's a lot of things you can't say, but moving forward, we need to apply our school policies. And we need to discipline the child based on your school system's policies and procedures. So maybe get a cue from them and ask them, where are you? Am I comfortable at this point? Any one of these 16, kind of let law enforcement drive it. And you kind of stay back. But remember, you do have an obligation to your board policies as well. So kind of get your cue from them. And again, sexual assault, boy on girl, girl on girl, boy on boy, they're all sexual assault. And do never, ever, ever, ever say that boys will be boys. That's why boys roughhousing, boys play like that. That is not. That's sexual assault. Some of the things that you hear about now with some of the football teams and some of those kinds of things, those are criminal offenses. They're not boys being boys. Sexual offense, you see here how they spend a lot of time talking about sexual offense, and it's of any age whatsoever. And the last one, of course, is taking indecent liberties with a minor. So those are the 16. You have an obligation. And the thing I want to leave with you, because I want to see this when you start turning in your ethics reports or your scenarios, law enforcement first, make that contact, and then your superintendent. And again, find out who your superintendent's office is, because I'm sure Charlotte Meck, you're not going to call up Wilcox and get him, but you'll call somebody. You'll have somebody for you to get. And that person is ultimately responsible for it. And make a personal note yourself and put it in a file that you've completed what you need to do with the duty to report. Because if some reason or another you didn't know about it and the superintendent's office did, and it comes back to you, you don't want to be caught in a position where you didn't do what you were supposed to do. I'm not saying the central office will throw you under the bus, but I would want my own particular documentation to CYA. All right, so what happens if you don't? Well, if you don't report it to the law enforcement and the superintendent, you'll see exactly what order they're in. When you've got personal knowledge of it and you don't do it, you're covering it up and you are an accessory to it, and you have violated the law, you're a misdemeanor, your professional license can be taken away. Notice that the timeline, it says that you must notify by the end of the workday. I would encourage you by the end of, within 5 minutes of you hearing about the situation, you certainly involve law enforcement, and within 10 minutes you have someone in the superintendent's office knowing about it. Now, I know all 8 of you are never going to have this problem. You're going to report when you're supposed to. So now when you do your scenarios, I'll get a chance to see that we understand that. Now, again, the one caveat about this is I'm not exactly sure about South Carolina, but I cannot imagine that South Carolina doesn't have a duty to report. And even though I tried to research it today and tried to find it, Courtney, I could not find it because South Carolina doesn't have it as neatly placed as North Carolina does. But if you ever find something, shoot it to me, and we will. I'll make sure I include it since we have folks from South Carolina. Any questions on this? I spent a lot of time on it, but I want to make sure that you guys, your district should go over this every single year with you. This should be at your beginning of the year district meeting. It's important enough that it's your license and your legal, I guess your legal butt if you get caught. So I am hoping that this is a part of the normal superintendent's address or whoever addresses you at the beginning of the year to kind of remind you of the things that you have to do. Also a reminder of 115C 288. If they don't, one of the best things you can do for your colleagues is to make sure that you share some of this information with them. If there's a beginning principal, because beginning principals may not know that, a brand new assistant principal, I don't know if we teach it or if it's taught well for master's degree program. I teach it to the students in my master's class here, but might be a good mentor if you are a mentor for someone, a new administrator in your district, to make sure that they understand this. Ignorance is no excuse. This is the law, and when you take on the duty of an administrator, you've accepted the conditions of 115C 288. Welcome to the wonderful world of administration. And if you're just covering for the day, you're the administrator. All right. Now let's move from gloom and doom to Fowler. Boring. Any questions on this before I close out? All right. So we are again on Zoom session 3, and the next class we have, of course, will be our face-to-face. You'll also notice that whenever we have a, this isn't the current one, this is from last semester, but after tonight or tomorrow, I'll go ahead and put up the Zoom session for tonight. It's always recorded, so if there's something you want to go back, feel free to do so. I have opened up the general statute and the duty. Oh, I haven't opened that one. Sorry, you should have told me about that. I would have opened it. So don't take notes if there's something on here, so you can copy it. And again, this is just from the general statute. So it is now open and available for you. Okay. Let me see if I have covered everything that I need to cover before we start doing our presentations. How's it going? Let me just do a fact check. How's everything going with the Fowler book? Anybody have started on your PAP, your policy audit? Have you selected your policy yet? Anybody? Want to talk about that for a second? Has anybody selected the policy that you're going to audit and work on? Oh my gosh, is that on your calendar? No, you don't have to do that yet, but it's not too far away.
I selected safety drills. So that's a policy. We're going to look at safety drills in our district and what we can incorporate to revise the policy, being that safety is such a hot button topic right now.
Yeah.
So I have my team, and we have a meeting scheduled. So I just don't know how the meeting's going to go just yet, but I'm excited about it, I guess.
All right. I saw your email out to the district. That was nice. Anyone else?
I'm going to do our student uniform policy.
You have uniforms in Kannapolis?
We do, yes.
Oh, wow. A lot of research on that.
Yes.
I resisted uniforms. All right, good. Anyone else want to share? If not, I mean, again, I'm just trying to make sure that you guys are on target because it's going to get here quickly. All right. Let us move on then. Now, according to my calendar, tonight we have 5 reports, and we're going to start with Shamika. Shamika, are you? I don't see you on my screen, but I know you're here. Oh, there you are. Shamika, down at the bottom, there's this, let me stop sharing. And then down at the bottom on this little green spot, you've done this before, I know, but just hit that, then the screen is yours. And again, while Shamika's doing this, let me explain kind of the purpose of these reports. One is for you to become an expert on the chapter and to be able to convey that. But the other, and this is where the rest of you have to help Shamika and everyone else presenting, you've got to help her along the way. When she asks for your opinion, she asks for input from you all, this is how you participate in the class. So if you have a slide built in there, Shamika, about what do you think, again, she shouldn't have to beg you, so at least 1 or 2 of you, when she or anyone says, what do you think, come on, let's jump in there and help it out. All right, Shamika, it is all yours, and I will try to stop talking, but I have a hard problem with that. So if I interrupt you during the time and I say I'm apologizing, but it's just because I want to add something to it, okay? No offense taken, it's just part of my personality.
Okay.
All right.
Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, everyone? Okay.
Okay.
It's all yours.
So good evening, everyone. I had chapter 7 for Fowler, and it's setting the stage and getting it on issue definition and agenda setting. And this was a very dense chapter with a lot of information. So I did my best to kind of hit the high points and to summarize the points that I think were very important to me. But I want to start out by talking about a lot of the reasons why we have discussions about policies and this process. In reading this particular chapter, I think 2 words came to mind for me in summation of the chapter, and it was money versus power. And I kept hearing those words echoing over and over to myself in my own mind when I was creating this presentation. And I even stopped to have a discussion with a few of my students, very general discussion about those 2 topics. And I kind of got a very, very interesting response that I'll share with you, hopefully if we have time at the end, with some of the information that I received. Well, anyway, there's really 2 parts to this presentation tonight. And the first one is going to address how policies are defined, issues within policies, and then, of course, how agendas are set to actually move from what we know as policy formation and adoption to formal policy. So there is, I think, a given perception versus a reality about policies, issues, and their definition. I tend to think that the perception of problems that become issues basically is that some people may view certain issues as an experience that all people may have or at some point in life will be subjected to. And I think that is a part of the perception for how we begin to define specific problems in our nature, whether that's in our school setting, whether it's in the community. But it begins with sort of the experience that perhaps one or all people may share. And then there's an expectation about this perception that whatever issue we are defining, is it going to be an issue that we will apply so that all people can be protected or will be protected or will benefit? There's another perception that speaks about the policy formation and process versus whether or not the policy will become formal. So basically in your government, if you can remember back to your government classes in 10th grade, or I think for most people it was 10th grade in traditional education, you were taught about how legislation create and form policies and adopt policies, but you didn't really focus on how those policies become official or formal. So there's kind of a little bit of, I think, perception versus reality with that. And then, of course, the idea that numbers don't really matter is just a perception, because in reality, we know that it is about the attraction and how relevant the problems are before they become issues. So these are just some of the ideas that I kind of hit on for how to move from problems to issues in defining the policy process. So what is the definition really for a policy? Well, one of the ways that we can define an issue is to make sure that we are developing a clear image, that there is discussion, that we can write and speak clearly and give a clear definition for that issue. And then you want to make sure that you have some appealing symbols that go along with that, so that it is an issue that in discussion there is no room for constraints or confusion, but that you are asserting a claim, that you're providing evidence, that the solution that you're proposing is realistic, feasible, and affordable. You want to make sure also that there is a broad appeal, that it's not too narrow in its focus when you write the description or the definition for the issue. And then also you want to make sure that you do your best to define it so that there is really clear interpretation and that is constitutional. So those are some of the ways that we move from going from problems to defining very clearly an issue. And it was stated on, I'm sorry?
Can I ask something?
Sure.
And this may be for the whole group, but when you look at her broad appeal, a high number of citizens and the audience who want this, you know, that's, you usually think of that as like a Proposition 8 or something in California, but have there ever been a policy that's been driven by popular maybe in your own district, and not on just Chemeketa, but in your district, that's really been driven by a real popular position being put out there by someone? I have one example in Caldwell, and I'll talk to you, and if you have one, you can share. But in Caldwell County, we have we still have a strong florist association. They meet ever so often. And I may have mentioned this before, but my first year there, the principals of the high schools and the middle school came to me and said, can we do something about the policy about delivery of flowers during school day, particularly Valentine's Day tomorrow? And so we developed a policy that limits the ability particularly on Valentine's Day, but other days as well, for florists to have access to our students to drop off flowers, because it was a huge problem. And so what we discovered, though, originally we just did away with flowers altogether at school. No, you can't deliver flowers at school. But what we discovered was that there were probably 5 or 6 florists in town who really pushed hard and pushed back with the Board of Education about that. Now, looking at the next to the last bullet on broad appeal, would you say 5 florists is broad appeal? What do you think? Because my board actually made us modify the policy. They actually listened to these 5 citizens who made us modify it, where the only day it's exempt now that you can't have whole-scale flowers is on Valentine's Day.
I think it depends on how many florists you have in that county that would make 5.
Okay.
Broad enough number.
We probably have about 10, so half of them.
Yeah, that's broad.
Well, here's to my point, Courtney, and everyone else. Those 5 people represent like a minute number of people in Caldwell County. A small, I mean, it's not even a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. Sometimes you're going to have a group in your community who wants a policy. Sometimes it's churches about using the facility. Sometimes it's other groups, Boy Scouts, it could be Girl Scouts. But you need to be very careful about, particularly that last bullet, in that those 3 or 4 people in your community who are the really big loudmouths, that they do not drive policy. Because I think those 5 florists were the loudmouths who drove a policy. And it did a disservice, even though we had to change the policy somewhat and we've strengthened it a little bit more. But I think that was a disservice because I think they were, I know they affected the policy and no one else cared. Kids, I mean, the students didn't like it, of course, but so be careful. 3 loudmouths do not make broad appeal.
Do you think one of those florists may have been one of those shadow influencers that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm. I know they were. They go to church. And that's the things that you don't know. They go to church. They also have connections, family members. You know, they did a great job at the wedding. They're very likable people, florists. They do a lot of favors for a lot of people. Not to mention the fact, and this is the one thing that I didn't really mind about kind of giving in to them, was the fact that every time we have a football program or every time we have a high school dance program, those high schools go to the florist, and the florists are some of the best advertisers. I mean, they donate their money, they donate their time. The florists were pretty good. And so that's kind of made me feel a little bit better about modifying the policy. But it was my first year there, and I was just bound and determined it was going to be my way. And this voice of 5 really did derail it. So that's a lesson learned too. It's not always your way. Listen to people. So, but beware of the noisy few. I'm sorry, Shamika, go ahead.
Okay. So then the second question that I would like to discuss is, why does the issue definition matter? Why is it even important? And I think one of the things that we have to consider is the structure and basically the influencers here. So we're looking at the structure and the nature of how the actual issue is defined, and who is really in charge of producing these ideas, and how do we move these ideas that could possibly eventually formulate a policy. So one of the really big I would say influencers would be the Education Policy Planning Research Committee. And in this chapter, it talked about the EPPRC consisting of about 24 different institutions that is supported by our United States, or one of our supporters would be the United States Department of Education. And there's a figure, 7.7 on page 153, that shows a breakdown of how the issue definition really comes into fruition, and ideas are clearly moved from a development process to a discussed process to a disseminating those ideas, and then looking at the research that may come from some of the, I guess we would say, I would call them professionals, experts at certain universities or institutions. Given that information is coming from specific individuals who are great influencers, they have then the power to publish an agenda. And you can look at different journals, and you can look at different, you can look at different types of educational publications where a lot of articles have been published by institutions such as your Consortium for Policy Research and Education. One in particular, you have special interest groups, but one in particular I know of is the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation has published a lot, or oversees a lot of research in problem-based learning. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is also a huge supporter of problem-based learning. So it's very interesting how, when you look at the diagram, that you have this breakdown of development and funding and discussions that kind of move these new ideas to a place where you start to see how policy can take place, or setting an agenda for that process for the policy becoming formal. In doing that, we have think tanks that are a really big part of the development process, and that's where you have your foundations and your research institutions that do a lot of the planning. You have funding that comes from wealthy individuals and corporations, some of it by way of endowments or grants, requests for proposals, or even contracts. And then, of course, your discussions help to forward those ideas as well, and those may come from associations. Today, we had an NCAE meeting at my school, and so different types of networks and interest groups like the National Teacher Federation, sometimes they can help kind of push along these ideas through engaging in discussions and having conversations. Some examples, I think, that the book talked about for different types of interest groups, such as liberals and conservatives. You have many of your corporations are attached to a particular political party for persuasion. Specifically, like I said, the Rand Corporation was really backed by the Carnegie Corporation, and that is one of your examples that was given for the Andrew Carnegie family. So he was a really wealthy businessman, and so a lot of his family members kind of participate in overseeing educational policies. And so there were many named in this particular chapter, but I focused on those because I was familiar with the project-based learning and the Rand Corporation out of California in connection with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well. Next, we talk about how to how to shape and influence the definitions, the ideology versus the research. So there's a power of persuasion in politics. A lot of our issues are taken under serious discussion, and we relate those to specific policy domains. So here we are again with sort of the two groups of political parties that may take a huge interest in a lot of the educational issues that could indeed become policies. And so you have this conservative view example that is given in this chapter that speaks about student achievement being very low in public schools. And the conservative view is that this is a result from the broken families or inadequate student and teacher efforts. And the conservatives, they don't tend to really trust in an active government. And then you have your liberalist view that looks at it a little bit differently and kind of try to define it from a larger social perspective, in that the issue may be that the children are hungry and that there needs to be more government regulations involved so it increases governmental spending. It may put some remedial school programs in place. So, kind of attacking the same issue, but from a different perspective. So the power of persuasion is one of the ways that shapes and influence the issue definition, but then also the type of research questions that are written and research questions that are investigated to try to perpetuate this idea of moving new ideas through our process from development to the funding to the discussion, and then eventually to disseminate this information to a published work. And there are three different types of research. It talks about the basic research, which is really theoretical based. It's really looking at behaviors and conditions and how the changes are happening from individuals. So in a classroom setting, perhaps, how does the knowledge move from it being B.F. Skinner's behavioral theory to one being able to construct their own knowledge? And then we have the applied theory, which is more of an evaluation of whether or not the theories are working. that are being implemented. So research on that. And then, of course, you have the integrative research that combines all of the different researches into one study. What I found when I read this chapter was that I started to think about my dissertation and the type of research that I've been looking at, and some of the examples that was given in the book. I realized that in writing my dissertation, there are going to be aspects or components of the dissertation that's going to contain perhaps all three types of the research. So that was very interesting to me to see how one can go from really thinking about these ideas and studying these ideas and giving support to these ideas based on the research from the foundations and research institutions and universities, how that information can eventually become policy. So how do we set the agenda? What are the steps? And then who's going to be the main influencers of setting these steps? Well, first, we develop these ideas. I've talked about that before. And then we discuss the ideas. Then we disseminate this information. For the early stages, who is going to be influencing the most? Probably not your school-based administrators, because for policy the process for developing a formal policy, that first stage is never really covered by media, so it's really done more in a private versus a public setting. And so the best way to influence that process, especially if it has to do with a national issue, is to respond in writing. Contact the person that's defining the issue, and then challenge those definitions locally.
Can I ask?
Go ahead.
Can I ask a real quick question for anyone out there? Is there, whenever your board decides to adopt a policy, I know they always have one first reading, then a second reading. Is there an outreach to, other than we've adopted it, we've read it the first time, it's going to be out there for 30 days, comment if you want. Is there a deliberate process for that information to get out to the Principals Association or for the next principals meeting for you to talk about the proposed policy, or is there nothing formal to do that? Anybody have an example of how your district does that? Because I think this is where we are with the agenda setting. Your role as a principal or someone in the field is important, and sometimes I think we overlook that.
I know in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, the information is shared through our intranet, so it's posted, and at that point, I think the principals or individuals that have interest in responding can write or email, or even I think the third way was, if I'm not mistaken, you could write, email, or call. I think that was the third way to talk about what challenges you have with those particular issues. But I think in Charlotte-Mech, it's published through our intranet. Is that right, Daryl? Am I right?
Yep, that's correct. I think for 10 days too. They post it for about 10 days and allow people to make comments on it, and then they kind of go from there.
Okay, so let me ask you then, do they make comments on it? Who's watching it to make comments on it?
So we have a policy administrator who is responsible for responding to any of the written concerns, and then that policy administrator shares that information with our, I believe our board attorney gets that information, as well as the members of the board that are on the policy committee.
Okay, so let me and again, I'm sorry I'm slowing you down, but the other point to that is, and I guess this is on the administrator part, probably more than the classroom teacher, because they have certainly a lot on their plate, but let's do administrators. But is there and I guess I'm trying to get at, and I know Charlotte Mack is a terrible example to use because it's so big and so many administrators, but a deliberate, I guess what I'm hearing you say is that they put it out there. If you want to comment, you can. There's no one explaining it. There's no one saying this is why the district wants to do this. This is the strengths of the district. The policy. This is why we think we need to go. And conversely, is there an avenue for you as a principal or an assistant principal to push a policy up and say, board, consider this? Or is that true in Kannapolis? Or is that true in any of our districts? Annie? Did you?
In Kannapolis, I think anyone can certainly propose something to the superintendent or assistant superintendent to get a committee going, but typically that's not done. The high school drives a lot under, social or student services. The uniform that Josh will speak of when he does his project has probably been the most grassroots one that I've seen, and it's been in effect, going on 15 years.
Okay.
And then I think your other question regarding, do we have someone? No, absolutely, yeah. I'm assuming that I don't think that came up when I talked with our person, but it would have to be public record, correct?
Yep.
So we just don't advertise it.
Right. And I think that's an easy way for most districts. Some districts, and I will tell you, I did not do this in Caldwell County, but it was done by others who worked for me. We always had a mid-month principals meeting where we threw the policy out there and we discussed it. And then we took that information back to the Board of Education. So when the board is having its second vote, or even before it even votes the first time, here's some feedback. We do it, a lot of you all do it with the calendar, I know. The school calendar is probably the best example. Okay, so to the point, and I guess this is why I've interrupted so much, to the point is that as an administrator, you got to be watching this stuff because policies will be coming all the time. And when you become the superintendent or you become the associate superintendent, whatever your goal might be, you need to have some way in which people can have a really free forum to talk with you about a policy before it gets too far. And too far may be the first reading. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so there are really two main types of policy agendas. You have the systemic and you have the government policy agenda. So with the systemic, this is just really educational issues that are maybe broad, people outside of the government and the media have serious concerns about, but within that you have three different types of agendas there. So you have the professional, that is under the discussions for networks and associations. You have public, that's where the general public may pay attention to those issues. And then you have, of course, the media, which is, other decision makers in the communication industry will place their focus on the media agenda. And then, of course, you have the government agenda, which is where all of your, I guess you can say, issues that are trying to become moved into policy is observed. And that's where an actual issue must be placed before it can actually become formal policy. It has to go on the government agenda. So what are the definition options? Well, you set the agenda, you evaluate how to keep it on the agenda until there's a decision made. What you don't want to have happen is that whatever your issue is becomes sort of left as a non-decision. In many cases, specifically, I think in Charlotte Mack, as of August of this year, I think it was, there are specific guidelines for elementary students per pupil. You can only have a certain number of students, but as we move up to the high school level, the restrictions were not as well defined. So there's a little bit of discretion, and it has been on the high school level with class sizes, specifically in our district. So, that's kind of where policies need to be extremely well defined. If they're not clear, then they're not perceived as being important. So you want to make sure that that's the case when you're writing a definition for an issue for a policy. As far as the government agenda, the way that those issues can be promoted or pushed to formulate a policy, you can have your governmental officials hold speeches and press conferences, any events that really affect the safety or the health of others can be considered a trigger event, and so that would get the attention of your government to put that issue on their agenda. Also, students with disability and their parents that have issues, or individuals that feel disempowered and will commit an act of violence to get the attention to an issue. All of those would be reasons to for the government agenda to address those issues.
A perfect example would be, I don't think you're going to have to wait too long to see some of our states have required immunization from measles. This measles outbreak, I'm pretty sure at some point we're going to have some laws strengthening the immunizations.
So that would qualify as a trigger event.
Yep, exactly.
Right. So who will get it done? What is the power resource at play? How will we do this? Well, you have an affect and an effect. Your agenda must make it to the government agenda from the systemic in order for it to become official or even to be considered a form of policy. You should have allies as an administrator. Work together with your state education commissioners. You want to work with your networks, be that your teacher education associations or your education associations in general. You want to work with all of your colleagues and your counterparts, and see that if the more people, the greater the number, the more influential you can be. Some of the expressions of concerns versus issues would cause you as an influencer to want to reduce some of the attention on the issues that may create, like Dr. Stone gave the example about the florist in his county. So although it is a concern and interest of a small population, it could influence policy in a way that it may not be better for the greater good, if I could use that expression. So you want to reduce issue attention. And then your audience, you want to draw attention for the attraction of those issues that are really important that you would like to become formal policy. You do that by using panelists and public speakers, getting the policymakers involved, your PR department, the media. You definitely want to have a great attraction and appeal for your audience. The impact of this would be to build better relationships and organizational effectiveness. So you want to move very quickly. You want to act, but you want to also act fast to be a great influencer. And you want to be well informed. Make sure that whatever policy you are trying to influence, or whatever policy you are really trying to have placed on that government agenda, that it's very, very clear, and that you're very knowledgeable about the events leading to you designing that issue definition. So you want to be well informed about the conditions for which that policy has been drafted. And this is a quote that I think speaks a lot to the movement of new ideas to forming a formal policy, and that is that, according to Patrick Ford, food is essential to a successful think tank. So for the people that are really having discussions and talking about issues, you want to be a part of that discussion. You want to be in the know. You want to be able to spark conversation between policy sponsors and scholars, because that's a part of the influential process. And last but not least, here are a few group discussion questions that I thought about. Two of them. One, is there an education or economic crisis in America? Which one would you say we are currently having? And then are there any best practices that are more influential than the funding sources that are supporting policy in a policy process? Why or why not? Oh, I mean, anyone can answer. I think the way that I separated this out into money wars is that I used United States and America as a distinction between the United States being the perception and America being the reality, and that in itself being sort of symbolic. And if you could speak to that based on whether you choose education or economic crisis, I think that would be interesting. What do you think?
I hate to talk out both sides of my mouth, especially when I'm eating peanuts. I'm sorry. But I think it's one and the same. I think that there is an education crisis in America right now, and I think that it's because of our economy.
Okay.
Well, Nora, I want to add to that. I agree with you 100%, but I think there's more. I think that what's driving the crisis in education is not education. What's driving the crisis in education is the fact that the values of this nation, the economic power of this nation does not support public education. So when people tell you that, or people tell me that public education is failing, I say, no, we are failing public education. Public education is not failing. We are failing to support it to where it needs to be supported. So I agree with you, but it is not because public education can't do it or isn't doing it well. It's because we just don't have people supporting it like it needs to be. That's my take on it.
I agree with that 100%.
No one trusts public education anymore. Lenore and I have talked about this. I mean, everyone assumes that we are the bad guys. And I see that change within the last 2 years, especially since I've taken over the principalship. People think that we are just out to get everybody. And I think that comes with, our public's respect against education in general. It's not valued as it once was. And you can see that in our state superintendent sending out that letter today, really talking about, we shouldn't put all of our emphasis on 4-year degrees and everyone going to college, and which I agree with. I just think that things like that and the way they're portrayed hurt public education, which causes a crisis.
Yep. All right.
I'm thinking that letter went out because they want to fund those institutions more so than the students attending to get the degrees. I think it's more so the economics behind that versus the genuine intent for the student to succeed and go to college.
Well, he did name Duke instead of a state institution, so that was interesting.
It's not surprising.
All right. Any other questions for Shamika? All right. Is that it?
That's it.
Great job. Lenore, you're up. Shamika, you have to stop sharing. All right. Find the little green spot down here, and there you go. You got it. And we will take a break after this one. Everybody see it? Thumbs up. Everybody can see it?
Okay. Right. Okay, guys. So my chapter sort of picks up, obviously, after Shamika. Shamika talked about the policy process and how you get ideas enacted into policy. She talked about the first two steps in that process: issue definition, defining the issue rather, and then making it important enough to get it on the agenda. My chapter talks about how you actually formulate the policy and then how you actually get it adopted. That's what we're going to be talking about. Let me find my notes. Now, Shamika alluded to this. She talked about the fact that the first two steps in this process of formulating a policy sort of happen very quietly. People are not really aware of them. But a lot of attention is given to the last two steps in the policy process. When you start formulating your policy, putting it into words, and you actually start adopting your policy, that's whenever school leaders, for the most part, become aware of the issue. And often, that can be too late in the process. Shamika talked about the fact that we need to, and even Dr. Stone said this, we need to find a way to be monitoring what is happening with policy locally as well as on the state level from the beginning, from the inception, so that we can begin to make influence. Waiting until the bill is getting ready to be voted on is too late to start reaching out to your legislators to contact them. And when this happens, this is the reason why a lot of school leaders feel like they've been blindsided. Like, where did this come from? I wasn't aware of that they were even doing this. So something very important has to happen in the policy formulation process, and that is that the policy has to be expressed in written language. And if you've ever worked with a team or a group on trying to wordsmith things and get an idea into words, it can be a very tedious process. Trying to get to draft a document or a phrase that conveys the meaning that you want it to be. Word choice is very important. There's a difference between may and must. Putting punctuation in different places can change the meaning of a statement. So a lot of tedious time goes into, a lot of tedious labor rather goes into actually getting the wording the correct way. So in this chapter, we're going to spend some time talking about what does formulating policy look like in legislators? What does it look like in administrative agencies? What does it look like in courts? And then we're going to end by talking about how you can influence policy formulation and adoption. And Shamika alluded to that in her chapter as well. She talked about some of the same things that were shared in my chapter. It's not unheard of to us as educators to know that people in the U.S. Congress and the 50 legislators, they're not required to fund all the policies that they spend all of this time trying to wordsmith, right? Have you ever heard of any? No,
you're kidding, right?
So let's talk about that for a moment. Why does that happen? Why do we spend so much time getting policies, drafting policies, creating policies, and then they're not funded? Why does that happen? Talk to me, somebody. Why is it popular or unpopular to fund?
Or to have unfunded mandates.
Right.
I think that goes back to Dr. Stone's comment of where it's not, education that's the issue. It's unfunded and it's happening. I mean, that's the problem right there, that we are policy happy, and but that's not where the money is being funneled. And I don't know how you change that.
I would agree with you. I think that a lot of our legislators want to be popular, and they want to please their constituents. And it's very popular to enact a policy. But when it comes to trying to allocate funding for it, that's unpopular. That's going to make you unpopular because inevitably that's going to cause your taxes to increase, and no one wants their taxes to increase. So,
Lenore, can I also add just to think about too, and you guys can think about it, but I also think sometimes they do it for lip service, that they want to please the constituents. Oh yeah, we passed this policy. We mandated now that schools provide this, and this. They could care less whether we do it, but they're just doing lip service because they have a constituency that wanted them to do it. And you're right, when you have to start paying for those things that you want, it makes a difference.
Yes, most definitely. Okay, so during the policy adoption stage, we all know that in order for a policy to be enacted, to become a law or whatever, the majority of both houses have to vote for it, and then in the end, the executive, the president, or the governor has to sign it. A few times that could be overridden by vetoes, but anyway, now once those legislators do all that wordsmithing on all that stuff, and they get the policy, they adopt the policy language, then administrative agencies have the opportunity to weigh in on that language as well. And we'll talk about how they do that. Judges and courts have an opportunity to give their opinions about the policies that have been enacted as well. So, what are the details? Let's look a little bit deeper, a little bit closer at how you actually formulate and adopt policies in legislators. I was reminded of the Schoolhouse Rock video growing up. I will not play it, but I put that here. It helped us see what the process is for a bill becoming law. But the legislative process started or was drafted or designed by our founding fathers back in the 18th century. And they were really concerned about some things. They were concerned that courts might one day find it really easy to change policies in a very hurried or speedy manner. So they put some principles in place to make the process of changing, of enacting laws, a conservative process. Conservative in terms of, not in terms of philosophy, but conservative in terms of how long it takes for a policy to actually become a law. And in fact, the author Fowler talks about the fact that they designed this process so that a bill would actually have to cross 18 different barriers before it could actually become a bill. That's how conservative this process is. It's not something that happens very quickly. And she gave an example from Colorado of how in the 2005 to 2007 legislative session that over 10,000 bills were introduced. Luckily, all 10,000 of those bills were not enacted into law, but only 417 of them were able to make it through those barriers to become law. Now, where do these proposals come from? Where do all of these ideas come from? Well, they come from many different places. Your legislators are the biggest originators of these proposals. They are elected, they have constituents, they have a list, sometimes a laundry list of things that they want to get done, bills that they want to sponsor or laws that they want to sponsor. Interest groups that interest groups are another source of proposals, like teachers unions, administrator groups, school board organizations, and such like that. And then, of course, your governors and not principal, but the president, they also have bills and things that they want to sponsor. So those are some of the places where these ideas or proposals come from. So next, we talked about how bills are actually drafted. And it's a very technical process. And I do have to admit that I wasn't quite aware of this. This was new to me in the book. It talked about the fact that legislators are not the ones who are doing this very technical or legal discourse. They're not doing the writing, but it's actually their staff that's doing it. There's a legislative drafting office that's staffed by lawyers who are actually doing this process. Were y'all aware of that? I wasn't. So,
well, Nora, that's because they're too. Well, never mind. Never mind. Go ahead.
Okay. If you're interested in more information about what does the bill actually look like, what are the components of it, you can look at figure 8.1 on page 177. And then next we talked about how do bills actually move through the legislator. Well, there's a formal process for that, for moving a bill through the legislator, and then there's an informal process for that. The formal process is that process that we're all pretty much familiar with. Somebody has got to sponsor the bill. There has to be a member of the House that sponsors it. They label it with the number, an identifying number, and then it moves into committee. And then from there, you know, it has to pass through the committees. It has to be voted on. And there could be a companion bill. You can have a bill in one house, and then you can have a similar bill in the other house. And if they both pass through, that's great. But if you don't have a bill in a similar bill in both houses, then that bill has to pass through one house, and then it has to go through the next house. And you can see how this could be a very time-consuming process to get your bill passed. In fact, it's actually a process that takes about 2 years to get that to happen. Then you've got all of these committees that are sort of the informal process. And this is where I suppose the politics really come into play. You want to really, that informal process of getting your bill to move through the legislator, you want to choose someone to sponsor your bill who has a good working relationship with people and with you. And you want to choose somebody to do it who is a part of the majority, a member of the majority party. Because you want your bill to be successful. The leadership of the House is the person who actually decides which committee or where your bill goes. And the book talks about the different kinds of committees. The leader of the House, if they don't agree with your bill or like your bill, they could send it to a killer or a death committee where you're basically not going to see that bill anymore. Or they can send it to the reference committee, and the reference committee could keep it there for a really long time. Or it could go to the standing committee where they keep revising it, and basically it just dies there. Or it could emerge quickly from the reference committee, and if it emerges quickly, then you pretty much know that that bill is going to get the support from other members of the House. So a really extensive process. And then this is after I got through reading all of that, I thought, wow, that's really labor intensive. That takes a lot of time. But at no point has anyone said anything about funding. So after you fight and you get it through all of those committees, then you have to start working on the appropriations and getting it funded. And a lot of times, if you're naive to this process, you've forgotten all about that, or you didn't even think about it. A good advocate needs to be aware of that from the beginning, thinking about not only the words, but also the money. You need to be thinking about those two things simultaneously. And if you really want to know what's important to a legislature, you need to read the law, but you also need to read the budget, because whatever they've appropriated in the budget is what they see or they have deemed as a priority. All right, so next we talk about policy formulation and adoption with administrative agencies. who are administrative agencies? The two that are talked about the most or referenced the most in the book are like your State Board of Education, or the Department of Ed. And why are they even necessary? Why do they need to come up with rules? Well, basically, it's because your legislators write sometimes very vague laws. They don't fill in the details. And that is left up to your administrative agencies, your Department of Ed, in order to fill in those gaps and those details. So that's why all of these rules need to be written. And once those rules are written, then they have what's known as the force of law. They are enforceable, and they can be reviewed by judges as well. And there was an example given of the Tennessee Education Department from the text. The Tennessee Education Department decided that it wanted to mandate cooperation between the State Department of Education with the Department of Mental Health. Okay, great, but what does that look like? So then both of those agencies had to come together and write some rules to determine, okay, who were they going to target? They had to spell out their budgets, et cetera, et cetera. And then once the State Board of Education voted on those things, again, those rules had the force of law and they had to be enacted. Rules, it's that advantageous to have your administrative agencies coming up with the rules, because a lot of times those administrative agencies are comprised of people like former teachers or college professors, et cetera. And these are people who are close to the issue, so they really know the pitfalls. Oftentimes they can see the loopholes that have been, that are present because of these vague laws. So you want to get those, you want to utilize those people. So that's one of the advantages of having them write these rules. That's basically all that needs to be said about that, I do believe. Okay, and then we move to judges. So what does policy formulation and adoption look like with courts? Well, judges are involved in this process, are heavily involved in this process, because once the policy has been enacted into law, they are the person who gets to interpret that law. And that the law that has been passed by the legislature, as well as, remember I said that if you've got administrative agencies that are doing rulemaking, that are writing rules, the judges get to judge those as well, or to interpret those as well. And they, once they review them, they have opinions, and they publish those opinions in what is known as case law, and that sets precedents for future cases that might come up.
And that's what your next face-to-face weekend is all about: case law, how it impacts policy.
And sometimes judges also have the, they certainly have the opportunity, but sometimes they will invalidate laws that have been passed because they deem them as being unconstitutional. One of the cases or case law that we're probably going to be talking about in the face-to-face coming up is New Jersey. And probably many of us know about the fact that the courts in New Jersey have overturned the state's finance system because it felt like it was unconstitutional. That was one of the examples that was talked about. Let's see, taking cases to court. Now, you just can't arbitrarily take any case to court. You actually have to have what's known as standing, which means that only individuals or groups who've actually been injured can actually take a case to court. And of course, there has to be some type of disagreement. You can't settle out of court. You know, there has to be an adversary, and you have to be able to name them. How judges formulate and adopt policy. There are trial courts and that's the lowest level of court in both the state and the federal court system, and those are typically tried by just one judge. It's important, though, because that one judge probably knows that his case is going to be, or his opinion is going to be reviewed and looked at by several other judges if it's been appealed. So he wants to protect his reputation. He wants to do a good job. So he's going to make sure that he's being very thorough. And then after the trial court, you have the U.S. Supreme Court or the state Supreme Court, and you've got either 9 judges or 7 judges who are sitting on those courts, and they are looking at what you have previously decided. And then, of course, you've got appellate courts, and there are 3 judges who are looking at stuff. So all of these are opportunities for judges to weigh in on the policies that have been enacted. There are lots of different examples from the chapter about how judges are making education policy. Examples of school finance, examples about attendance laws. There are cases from Indiana in which a school board, a court decided to uphold a school board's power to require the teaching of a certain curriculum. There's information about taxes and how states have the authority to use tax money to support public education. There's a lot of information out there. And most of this stuff occurred in the 19th century. And then still later in the 21st century, we still have a lot of court cases about school finance policy.
Has anybody ever heard of Judge Leandro? Judge Manning.
Yes.
Oh yeah, you'll hear that one next weekend.
Despite the fact that there are a lot of cases out there that have been tried in state courts, there are not a lot of federal court cases about that have an impact on education. The author talked about the fact that there have only been 7 cases, education type of cases that have been tried in federal courts. And one of them, or I'll give 2 examples of those, the author talked about one from Nebraska. Nebraska decided that they wanted to have a law in 1923 that prohibited the use of any language other than English in a K-8 school. And that went to court, and of course that was unconstitutional, so they struck that down. And then the other example was one from Oregon, in which there was an Oregon statute that was deemed unconstitutional because they decided that they want to mandate that all children attend public schools in Oregon. So that got struck down. All of that to say that judges do shape education policy in their courtrooms. And then this last slide sort of mirrors what Shamika was talking about. How can you influence policy formulation and adoption? What can you do to get to be aware and to have some influence? There are some general principles, and we've talked about them already. Basically, be aware of what's going on, monitor what's happening in your legislature. And I think Shamika said that you can do this by being a part of your professional organizations. Professional organizations usually have a government relations department or person on staff, and they are typically watching what's happening in the legislature, and they're reporting that information back out to you through emails or on their websites. Be a part of those professional organizations so that you can monitor what's happening, so that it won't be the 9th hour and the bill is getting ready to be voted on and you hadn't heard anything about it. One of the things that I liked from this chapter is there was a quote from President Lyndon Johnson that talked about how can you influence legislatures and how can you influence agencies. Well, the time to make friends is before you really need them. So build those relationships with people before the bill gets ready to be voted on. And the chapter talked about several different suggestions about how you can start building relations with government officials. Some that just jump out in my mind really quickly are, as sometimes I'm guilty of thinking that my stakeholders are kids and parents, but really your stakeholders do include your legislators. So you need to include them as well. Put them on your email chain. Invite them to appropriate events. Find ways to develop relationships with them. Network. That was something that Shamika talked about. Networking with them. Network with them in professional organizations before you need them. Develop these relationships with them. And remember that, communication is a two-way street. So if you've got to be willing to receive messages from them as well as send messages to them. Okay, let's wrap this up. We're talking about how you can influence people. I'm just looking really quickly at my notes. And then lastly, I want you to weigh in on this topic, lobbying. And this is another way that you can influence policy formulation. Let's talk about lobbying. What is lobbying? And I'm going to skip ahead for a moment. Here's the question that I have for us. The chapter suggested that we find a copy of legislation that governs lobbying and gifts to politicians in North Carolina. What do we already know? And so I did that. I've got some information, but I really don't want you to look at it yet. What activities are permitted and what activities are forbidden about lobbying? What do you already know? And then we'll take a look at what the law says.
I really don't know. I know I've only heard bad things about lobbying, that it's kind of corrupt or influential.
Can we be lobbyists? Can school administrators and education leaders, can we lobby?
That's a negative, according to board policy and CMS. We can't pick a side for politicians.
Yes, we have to be careful. We have to be nonpartisan. So what does that look like, being nonpartisan?
Not allowing campaigns from only one side of the election and having both sides at least, have their opinion expressed, or both sides have the ability to provide support.
Exactly. Thank you, Daryl. So one of the things about lobbying that stuck out the most to me is this question that I have on the bottom of the slide. Are you, as an educational leader, are you performing a fundamental part of your job responsibility? When you're thinking about, am I crossing the line by doing this? If it's a fundamental part of your job responsibility, then you're okay. And you have to also think about, how long is it going to take for me to explain my actions to somebody? If it's going to take a really long time for me to explain my actions to somebody, I probably shouldn't be doing this. But if I quickly explain to you, no, I'm doing this because it impacts my students in this way, then you're pretty much safe. So let's look at what is permitted. So let me back up for a second. Let me say this about lobbying. Public officials who contact legislators or agency workers in an official capacity about issues that affect their work, they're technically not lobbying. They're really just performing a fundamental part of their job. However, you do need to be cautious because lobbying is a heavily regulated political activity that requires you to register and requires you to file a lot of detailed paperwork. There are some effective ways that you can lobby, and Shamika talked about writing, visiting, and calling people. So let's take a look at this slide. What are some of the things that you can do, and what are some of the things that you can't do? So these things are permitted. There are some, you can't give gifts. However, there are exceptions to the gift ban. So if you have food and beverages for immediate consumption at a quote unquote free public event, then you're okay. The important thing there is it has to be a free public event, and there needs to be a sign announcing that it's a free event open to the public, or a public event rather. For legislators, public events include those events where an entire legislative body has been invited, and there needs to be at least 10 other people there for you to be safe. The next bullet, it talks about public servants and the fact, again, that there needs to be 10 people there.
And that's you.
Yes, yes. To meet this exception, the event must have a sign indicating that it's open to the general public, and reasonable expenses for educational meetings are acceptable. But there needs to be at least, again, 10 or more attendees there. There needs to be a formal agenda, and there needs to be notice given 10 days in advance. And you can give plaques or non-monetary mementos. These things are okay. However, these things are strictly forbidden.
All right, so you can give that mug that says Kannapolis City Schools. That's fine. But
Well,
not a sterling silver one that says thank you or something like that.
right, that would have to be reported through some special process that I'm not sure what it is. So forbidden, these things. Lobbyists can't make campaign contributions to state legislators or public servants or their offices. Lobbyists don't collect or deliver campaign contributions. State legislators and public servants are permitted from registering as lobbyists. Lobbyists are restricted from serving on certain boards. Nonprofits can't use state funds. Please don't take your school funds and donate it to a political to anybody. Don't do that. You're going to have to collect some money from some other way. And then in addition to these things, the author talked about the fact that you also need to check to know what the local norms are in your area. If you're new to an area, check with other administrators or administrators to see what they do. Do they customarily donate $100 to every person who is campaigning, or do they just do $5 to everybody, or do they not do anything to anybody? But as Daryl said, you have to be nonpartisan. You have to be impartial. If you invite one perspective, you have to invite all perspectives. You can't show favoritism to one party over the other. That's lobbying. Those are the do's or don'ts. So what were my key takeaways from this section? As an educational leader, part of your responsibility is to work to obtain the best possible policies for schools, which means that you cannot shy away from politics. You can't avoid it. And unfortunately, well, anyway, I won't say anything about that. If you do avoid politics, then you're sort of putting yourself at risk for seeing one ineffective policy after the other. Your legislators are going to get advice from somebody. It might as well be from you, because they're going to listen to somebody about education. So as an educational leader, we need to be able to model effective citizenship in a democracy. Oh, and one last thing, never lobby a judge, because their decisions need to be based on precedents and their reasoning, not anything that you said. Never lobby a judge. Okay, that's it. Thank you, guys.
Excellent job. So we're going to take like a 3-minute break. We're going to come back and Lindsay, you're up. So in about 3 minutes, if you will release your screen, Lenore.
Okay.
We'll be back in about 2 to 3 minutes. Lenore, you did a great job on that chapter. You too, Shamika. Great job. And I'll have to tell you, Shamika, your chapter was very boring to read it. Oh, it was the worst chapter yet.
Sorry.
The whole book is not my favorite. All right, Lindsay, are you back? Okay. Shante, you are here. Courtney, are you back? Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We have about 30 minutes left and 3 reports. So, Lindsay, if you can move through yours in about 10 minutes, and if you don't mind
I'm
me
back.
kind of interrupting, same way for you, Shante, and same way for you, Courtney. And we'll try to be out of here by at least 8:35 at most. So are you all comfortable with me kind of being your timekeeper and saying when you have about 2 more minutes? Everyone okay with that? All right, let's roll, Lindsay.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I had chapter 9 of the Fowler book, Policy Studies for Educational Leaders. A wealth of information, just hard to break down all of it within a 10-15 minute PowerPoint, but I tried to hit the highlights. As far as learning to analyze the public policy, school leaders should know about policy development, the formulation, the adoption, and also how to tear apart policies, but also scrutinize them. School leaders should be able to disaggregate, scrutinize the policies, because once you're a school leader, you're going to have to establish and adopt various policies during your reign as a school leader. Whether it's policies that you establish yourself or policies that you adopt and maybe have to edit to fit your standards. Specific policies that school administrators formulate or establish are those in the areas of student dress codes, tardiness, or student absences. Anything that could be related to student behavior, that's considered policies established by school leaders. School leaders should understand the various policy options available in all the context of the policy, everything that policy entails. When studying policy implementation, it is important to understand policy structure. There are certain aspects to consider. Certain aspects include, number one, how's the policy going to work? You really have to map it out to make sure you have a good understanding of how you expect it to work. Number two, how will various stakeholders react, whether internal or external? Number three is what problems could arise from this specific policy? Any negative consequences? What's the positive attributes of it? Number four, what will the cost of the policy be? What's the cost of implementation? Everything has a cost. Lowy, techniques of control. Theodore Lowy stated that there are 3 basic types of policies. Each one generates a distinctive political area. With every policy, you're going to deal with politics. The 3 basic types of policies, according to Lowy, includes distributive, regulatory, and redistributive. Distributive policies are formulated from gifts given to citizens in the form of goods, services, or special privileges. Contracts are formed under distributive policies. Examples include professional development programs that teachers have to go through, subsidies for school transportation, your buses, school lunch and meal programs, state or federal block contracts or grants, contracts with textbook companies, testing companies, parking permits that's issued to students and staff. So contracts are a big part of these policies. The second type's regulatory, formalized rules. In general, basically what it is for a large group of people. Most regulatory policies take the form of laws or administrative rules, prohibit certain behaviors. An example would be the fact that teachers and administrators' license are regulatory. Examples of regulatory include graduation requirements by high schools or colleges, curriculum frameworks, dress codes of schools, compulsory attendance requirements, school discipline codes, as far as student behavior. The third type, according to Lowy, was redistributive policy. Basically, where it shifts resources from one social group to another. The government usually shifts material resources by manipulating taxation or the monetary system. A good example of a redistributive policy would be Social Security, because it's not a form of insurance, but a redistribution of income through taxation. Examples of the redistributive policy would include desegregation, Title I, Title IX vouchers, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So here's some examples, exercises of the techniques of control. Identify each of the following policies as distributive, regulatory, or redistributive. So if you were faced with a federal preschool program for poor children, would you consider that distributive, regulatory, or redistributive? Anybody have any ideas or want to guess?
Redistributive.
It would be, yes, ma'am.
Yep, just like Title I.
Right, exactly.
Any kind of program here that, or policy that relates to something that's not, that somebody could look at and say, everybody's getting the same amount. But redistributive means that some people are getting more, but it's based on a factor like poverty, or it's based on a factor like exceptionality or something. So that's what redistributive is.
Okay.
I'm gonna move you along. You got about 4 more minutes.
Okay. School leaders feel pressure daily. Like I said, you need to think about the costs when implementing policies. Levin and McQuan recommend a system for estimating the tangible cost of a policy or program. The chapter goes more in depth with it. School leaders should take into account personnel, facilities, equipment, materials, everything that's needed for that policy implementation. Costs should always be analyzed as with everything else. Using the techniques of control, leaders at the district level plan several policy changes over several period of time. They're incorporated, established, but there should be a mixture of distributive, regulatory, and redistributive. There should be never a set amount of the same policies at one given time. It is important for district leaders to understand the stakeholders involved. Like I said, the political area brought forth from the politics. District leaders should be careful not to make too many policy changes, like I said, at the same time or within the same group. Mandates, it went on to talk about mandates as rules governing the actions of individuals and agencies. A good example of a mandate is the compulsory school attendance law. Mandates, of course, require strong political support. For school leaders, reflection and thoughtful analysis are important when one is developing policies or implementing policies. Policy implementation fails when those in charge do not carefully consider all the information included in the policy, such as like I've emphasized with the stakeholders and or the cost. And that's the end of my presentation. Any questions?
All right, before you leave, Lindsay, because you do have about another minute or two.
Okay.
What was your biggest takeaway from this chapter? Just off the top of your head, what was the biggest takeaway?
My biggest takeaway was I actually enjoyed learning about the three the techniques as far as the distributive, redistributive. I never realized that there was so much within policy implementation, and the fact that it emphasized the cost, stakeholders, whether internal, external. There's just a lot to consider with policy implementation. A big wealth of information in this chapter, definitely. It's very interesting.
Definitely. And another big takeaway, of course, is that you got to consider cost in everything. And
right.
Money drives policy, and those she talked about the 3 different ways. Thank you, Lindsay. Are you feeling bad? You got like a nasal.
Yes, sir. I've had a bad cold this week.
I hope you feel better.
Thank you.
Shante, you're up. You've got 8 to 9 minutes. And again, folks, I really do apologize this, but I really got into the earlier one, so I didn't do the timekeeper thing like I was supposed to. So my fault. Shante.
Hello, everyone. I have chapter 10, policy implementation, and it's getting people to carry out a policy. And let me move my screen over. This is hard. It talked about, if we all know what implementation is. We've had to implement a lot of things in our schools already, but it says implementation is the process of carrying out authoritative public policies directives. So carrying out what we're told to do. Of all the stages of the policy process, implementation has the most education leader involvement. So we're all involved in this class in some shape or form or fashion. Implementers, the major actors are the implementers. And first it starts off with the formal government officials who have the legal authority to see that a new policy is put into effect. Then we have the administrators who work in the U.S. Department of Education or in the State Department of Education. Then it comes down locally to the superintendents and other central office administrators. And then we have the intermediaries who are the implementers delegated by the formal implementers to help with implementation. So I'm thinking that's at the school level. And Dr. Stone, I don't know, would that be at the school level? Would we be considered the intermediaries?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
You got the superintendent, then the principals, and then assistant principals, and technically the teachers. So you're all, yeah, everyone at that point. Yes.
Okay. So just thinking about it from, he said from the state board all the way down to the classroom teachers. And I'm gonna be honest with you, when I was a classroom teacher, I never really thought about policies or what was happening to me. But now since I'm in the leadership role, I think about it every single day. I'm gonna go through the research behind it. The difficulty of the implementation is 3 areas of research. The first one was the difficulty of implementation. Why is it so hard to implement a policy? And basically, it said it's hard because, I'm going fast through the slide. No, it was saying that you have to put in the work. At the beginning stages of implementation, you have to be willing to put in the work. And oftentimes, the people who are tasked to carry out or implement a policy lack the skills and knowledge to implement the policy. They are not given the skills. Classroom teachers, sometimes when they got the No Child Left Behind or the what's the one that the Common Core, no one knew what to do with it because everybody was working on a different set of standards. So to get this policy all of a sudden, they didn't train you. They just told you, here it is. Let's give a 1-day PD on it, and now you implement it. So that was just saying that the intermediaries often lack the skills and knowledge.
And sometimes too, they sabotage it. If they don't like it, they don't do it.
Yeah, so it talked about a lot of resistance that comes from a lot of people start off very strong and then they lose speed. And some of them, because they don't know how to implement, like Dr. Stone said, they sabotage it. And sometimes you don't know that you're sabotaging it. The second one is the analysis of failures and successes. And it was saying that now it's getting a little easier to implement policies, but so you experience failure and successes. Failure is not always bad because failure allows you to see your mistakes and fix them. Sometimes rushing to success doesn't always get you where you want to be. So they did a study where they looked at highly successful, who was highly successful. That means they had a lot of support from the people who are the authorities, and then relatively successful, they kind of eased off and started losing support, and this is where a lot of schools fall, and a lot of people relatively unsuccessful, where you started off strong and now you don't know what's going on. You're starting to see that it's not beneficial to you and kind of lack that momentum that you started having. And then the unsuccessful implementation, you're just in it for the wrong reason. And I think that might fall with Dr. Stone was saying, when you sabotaging it, you really don't care about it. It was given to you, you're just going to do it just to get by. So that was those. But it said the lesson that was most important here is implementation is difficult. Some policies never get implemented. And I heard previous people talk about that. They put them out there, but they never get off the ground because we don't know how to get it off the ground. And successful implementation is possible. It's difficult, but it is possible. The third one, we talked about the learners. I think we mostly A lot of us fall in this one, implementers as learners. People are learning new information. When you learn new information, you tend to build on your personal schema and things that you know. So you bring your personal background to the subject matter. Sometimes that's not good because you're not learning what the policy. I know, thinking about Common Core, I knew QCCs. So I used to base everything on how we used to do QCCs. So when you get to dealing with your personal background, it kind of sabotages where you're trying to go. So I think that it talked about in the book that more support is needed in the form of coaching, just training. You just can't give someone a policy to implement and expect them to be successful with it without the proper training and support. How to implement a new policy. This is one of a school leader's most important tasks. Central office staff and principals play an integral role in implementing the policy. Mobilization is a crucial step in implementation. So it's 3 steps: policy adoption. Then we go into the planning stage, and then the gathering of resources.
And I'm gonna add right here, because we're down to about 2 minutes. But this is what you did the first face-to-face weekend. You were really beginning to write the policy, but within that writing, you were doing the adoption. But had we had opportunity to move forward, you would have had the planning and the gathering of the resources to make that happen. So you did the first step at least. And you do have about 2 minutes, Shante. So
okay, let me go right here. I was the stages of implementation, early stages, where it's the grassroots implementers, which are usually the classroom teachers. You get the policy, they tell you we have a new uniform policy, you need to implement it. And it's sometimes you have a rough start, and it's a combination of pressure and support. We're telling you what to do, and you just do it, and we give you a little support along the way. The stage of the late stages of implementation is where everything is starting to get a little bit more comfortable. You know what you're doing. The policies are easy to refine. You can make changes as needed. And the key takeaways from this chapter is implementation is important, but often dreaded by school leaders. It's the implementation of a policy is hard work, but over time it gets easier for a more confident leader who has used past mistakes to improve. And I know a lot of times this was the key part for me, is that when it said that implementation, when it fails, you didn't really fail. Because when we think of failure, like we didn't do something right. But when it comes to the implementation process, sometimes failure is good. It says when you rush to do it, something didn't go right. And it was just successful, but you didn't think about all the tiny pieces that made it successful. So failure allows you to go back and look deeper at some of the mistakes that were made and fix it for future policies.
Great job. All right. So implementation, thank you, Shante. Implementation is all about how to get it going and the stages of it. Excellent job. You did a great job.
Thank you.
I have you, Courtney, for the last 10 minutes to talk about chapter 11. Shante, if you will stop sharing, and Courtney can pick it up.
Let me stop share. Okay.
There you go. And again, folks, I apologize for this. I'm the gatekeeper, timekeeper. My fault. I just really failed you on that one. But you guys do a great job. I was enjoying it. All right, Courtney.
I'm trying to share my screen. Give me a second.
That green button?
I don't know what it disappeared on me.
It's down at the bottom. It would be the green button.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. There you go. And Courtney, you have about 10 minutes. So.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip an activity that I had. So I had chapter 11, policy evaluation, determining if the policy works. I feel like a lot of the content that was discussed in this chapter, we have had a lot of in-depth conversation about in our previous courses. So I did not put a lot of information in it. I was going to do a Menti activity to kind of see where everyone is. Why do you think we evaluate? Does anybody want to throw anything out really quickly? Why do we evaluate? And you can take that in any way that you Whatever comes to mind when you think about evaluations. Why do we evaluate things?
To see if what we're doing is working.
Okay.
To see where we are.
Okay. Can I get one more?
To see if
See
it's
if
working,
any
Mike.
changes are necessary.
All right, thank you. So the need for evaluation, I took this straight out of the book. We can't make our programs better unless we know where we are. What are we strong in? What are we weak in? What do we need? How far are we in that continuum of making progress? What steps have we already taken that have worked? What steps have not worked? So although it may be painful, it may a lot of times feel punitive, it's very, very purposeful if it's done the correct way. And evaluation is also unavoidable. I know we've talked about evaluation a lot, and I think someone is doing their dissertation on teacher evaluations, but it was very interesting to read about policy evaluations. But evaluation across the board seems to serve the same purpose. It's for growth. These are some definitions that are associated with policy evaluations, but in my mind, two of them are with any evaluation. But what is evaluation? It's the systematic investigation of the quality of a program or project or any of the other components for the purpose of decision making that will lead to improvement and or accountability. What is a project? When it comes to policy evaluation, policies are often first put into effect through projects, thinking about Title I, Title II, things like that. What is a program? When projects are institutionalized, they become programs. And then stakeholders, I believe that Lenore talked a lot about stakeholders, individuals or group who have legitimate interest or a hand in the policy or what's going on. So the characteristics of policy evaluation, these were 7 things that Fowler pulled out. One, the purpose of a policy evaluation is to determine the goals of the policy. Why did we even put this policy into place? What goals is it to reach? Some of you all have talked about your policies that you've chosen, like safety. So whatever policy you're putting in place, what is the goal of it? What specific goal are you trying to reach? To select indicators, how are we going to determine along the way if we're achieving those goals or if this policy is effective or not? Number 3, to select or develop data collection instruments, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, and we learned a lot about that in our last course. To collect data. So evaluation should be continuous, and I'll talk about the different types of evaluation. To analyze and summarize data, to write a report, and then to respond to recommendations. Again, all of those steps are for growth. So when we put a policy in place, we want to achieve the goals and the intent of that policy. Sometimes they have to be amended. Sometimes they have to be done away with. Sometimes they have to be changed. But we want to make sure that we're reaching the goals of those policies. So the criteria for judging evaluations, it talks a little bit about these. I won't go into detail, but whenever you're judging an evaluation, think about the utility. Was it used for? Feasibility, propriety, and then accuracy of the policy that has been put in place. And then these are the different types of evaluations that were discussed in this chapter. Summative evaluation, and we've talked about these terms in our last course quite a bit. Formative evaluations, and then this was a newer one, a pseudo evaluation, and it's basically just to make a positive public image for something. The book, or Fowler, he talks about how a lot of times pseudo evaluations can be unethical. And I wanted to get Dr. Stone to add in on that. Like, what are some examples of pseudo evaluations? Because it kind of made it seem like it's basically you want to do an evaluation on a policy to kind of boost it up and make it seem like it's something good when it may not be as effective as what it was intended to be. Am I understanding that correctly?
Think of it this way. Think I'm the new superintendent in your district, and I really, really love Letterland, which is a phonetic program or thing. And I create a policy. Letterland, I love it. Nobody else loves it. So I make sure that every bit of the research, every bit of the evaluation, I put my hand on it so it's really positive, and it's really positive only to me. So it's when you really are doing a con job.
Bias.
Yep.
Bias. All right, perfect. So that was new to me, new information to me. And it talks about the different methods in doing evaluations on policies. We have heard these terms a lot with Dr. Laura Boyles. Quantitative and qualitative methods. It listed some examples. So quantitative methods of policy evaluation would be transcripts of interviews, notes on observations, diaries, official reports, photographs, books, legal documents. And then qualitative methods would be your test scores, retention, attendance, dropout rates, per pupil expenditure. I think I confused the two. Quantitative, enrollment figures, and percentage of teachers with master's degrees or doctoral degrees, et cetera, et cetera. These things can be used to evaluate a policy on whether or not it is.
And save all of this for your dissertation, because some of you are going to do policy evaluations or program evaluations. You'll use all this stuff, whatever you choose for your particular model.
Right, and then these are some tools you can use if you're doing a policy evaluation, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, to get that data that you need. And then it talks about how evaluations are political, and I think this makes sense because of the last conversation that we had on our last Zoom session about politics and how policy is politics. There's no way around it. In education, policies are driven by politics in a lot of cases. But the book pulled out 3 specific reasons or examples to explain why evaluations or policy evaluations are deemed to be political. The first one was that the programs and projects that are assessed are the products of the political process. Point blank, that goes back to how politics drive policy. The second thing was evaluation reports influence what happens in the political arena, often affecting whether a policy is continued or how much funding it receives. I think someone had a conversation about why do we spend so much time writing these policies. I think that was Lenore, if there's not going to be any funding involved. Evaluation reports and the reason why we do policy evaluations can affect politics. Finally, the careers, professional reputations, and educational benefits of many individuals actually depend on these evaluations.
Courtney, can you wrap up in about a minute?
Yes, I have one more slide. So that kind of goes basically with teacher evaluations and every evaluation. A lot of times positions are dependent upon what the evaluation says. So do we keep a policy or not? That depends on the evaluation. So the major takeaways from this chapter, evaluation is inevitable and it is necessary. So there's no way around it and you need it. And you just have to accept that fact. Evaluation is political, no way around it. There is a method to the madness, so there is a way to properly complete a policy evaluation. If you do a policy evaluation, the goal is for growth to take place, and then we shouldn't despise evaluations. We should despise either the evaluator or the evaluation tool.
I like that one. Okay. Any questions for Courtney? Because we are right at the time, and I wanted to do one real quick little thing. Any questions for Courtney? If you'll give it back to me, Courtney. Stop sharing. All right. The last thing I want to say is that those of you who presented tonight, again, I apologize to the last 3 of you. If you want to go ahead under course assessments, I believe that's where you go ahead and post these. If you want to make any changes, go ahead and do that. But under course assessment, there's a place for you to put your policy evaluation. So I think that's right. Yep, course assessments, presentation. Yeah, under course assessments. All right, next week, no class next week. Next weekend, you're in Charlotte. You'll have Dr. Davis. And then we'll be back on the 27th. Any questions? You all did a great job tonight. All right. Have a great week. Thank you.